Welcome to Extraction News for the month of July. My name is Emmett McGregor, CEO of Sci-Fi Systems. Here with me today is Stephen Furr, our Business Development Coordinator and longtime extraction business operator. We're here to discuss what's happening in cannabis and hemp news around the United States as well as globally. This video will be coming to you in two parts. First part, general news from around the industry, and part two, legalization at the federal level and the states. What's happened in July and what's upcoming. Today, for part one of Extraction News July, we're going to be discussing trends from around the industry, pricing stabilization, tax reform, and irradiation. Will the industry pick it up in mass, or will consumers refuse to buy? Well, Steve, why don't we start it at the top with everybody's favorite news? It seems like prices are not going down.
Well, it's kind of interesting data because you have to go back before COVID, and look at the trends before COVID, because COVID had a great impact, obviously, on pricing, and with Americans having more time and more disposable income during the shutdowns. And then there was a crash, right? A crash. In fact, in some states, the biggest crash. In states like Colorado, the prices have really hit bottom. But the good news is that prices are stabilizing, and I think that speaks to that marijuana venture article we had the month before on smart money focusing on processing and talking about those predictable, boom, bust, and then stabilization. And we're seeing it finally on a national level.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting looking at the maps here, seeing how, yes, there's some areas of the country that are seeing more rapid stabilization at higher price points, states like Nevada, New Mexico, again, where they're relatively younger markets, but they've also had relatively fewer entrants into the market. Those states seem to be faring very well. Of course, you still have high prices on the East Coast, and however, we are seeing more rapid declines in those prices. But overall, the general picture is now maybe businesses can take a breath, do some long-term planning, and start thinking about how to keep the price where it's at. There's no big coordination across the industry on this point, but at a certain point of supply, things will contract. We seem like maybe in states like Oregon and in Colorado as well, we're actually seeing the supply starting to come down to levels that are equal to demand or closer to equal to demand. And that is including on processed products, like you mentioned. So maybe the processors are getting more efficient at dealing with the growers, and we're seeing more efficient conversion of that into processed products. So there's not a lot of excess flower keeping the price driving down. That, as well as a drawdown in overall cultivation in those states to a level that actually makes sense to supply the overall demand in the state. This is actually really great news.
It is. You look at it says here from Cannabis Benchmarks on July 14th that the average price of a pound of flower was $1,020 nationally. You look in states like Nevada, Arizona, in California, they're around $700 a pound. So those are definitely tough states to be working in. But it's interesting that it points out here in Washington, D.C., they have the highest prices in the country, and yet there's a lot of confusion about what's going on. Maybe you can elaborate on what's going on in the Washington market right now, D.C.
Well, there is a medical market in Washington, D.C. with streamlined sales. However, on the recreational side, it's adult use consumption and home grow. Although I understand there's relatively stringent restrictions on home grow from a homeowners association and apartments and all of those things sort of level. But it seems like they're still able to track a trade value of the pounds, even in that sort of gray area type of trade that's going on there. I do wonder if this data is coming exclusively from the medical dispensary market, or if this is including more, shall we say, de facto recreational pricing as well.
And there's been some movement on, or at least some discussions at the federal level on taxes. Shall we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's as we know, the cannabis industry has been way overpaying taxes as compared to any other industry, even industries like alcohol that have luxury taxes associated with them. I think the numbers from the news were that basically 25% of cannabis operators surveyed indicated profitability. Many unprofitable companies specifically cited tax burden as a reason for them not achieving profitability, even in the face of growth. So this is very challenging, and this all goes back to the banking regulations and 280E. It seems like we have some growing support for reform on the financial side of the cannabis industry that might help remedy a lot of this, onerous burden on these businesses.
One of my favorite stories that came up about taxes, and I am quoting, it is from the Green Market Report. And it talks about the largest cannabis producers in the country. And the summary of it is that collectively, the 10 largest growers in the country owe over $500 million in federal taxes. And this is no mistake. This is by design. And as we all know in the cannabis industry, because there's no banking, you go to look for financing and it's 25%, 3 points up front with prepayment penalties, right? So what these companies are doing is they're making monthly payments. And we're talking about the canopy growths and the Curaleafs and the biggest players in the country. They're using the IRS as their de facto bank for funding their operations, really. Because the IRS, I believe, charges about 7% interest on debt. So they're just making monthly payments on their debt. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's a hairy strategy. I'm sure that they have very good accountants and tax attorneys advising them on how to manage this appropriately. Because of course, the thing that they want to avoid is extremely onerous audit expenses, as well as the potential for other penalties outside of simply the tax interest rate. So we're certainly not advising anyone pick this up as a strategy, but it does indicate a flawed system, and efforts to reform that system, of course, are not doing nothing but gaining steam. Although, it seems like one step forward, one step back, stuck in the same place for a long time. Maybe, just maybe, now there are indications of some changes. Do you want to talk about the Safe Banking Act?
Well, there are some discussions that the Safe Banking Act might actually make it through committee. The hope is it will make it through committee and be brought up for a vote. I think that the current political climate right now is still very difficult, and so it's going to be interesting to see if the Republicans are going to allow it to be brought up for discussion. What is your take on it? What? Because I have my opinions, but what do you think?
Well, we've definitely seen some contradictory articles in the news over the past couple of weeks. The one I'm looking at now from Cannabis Business Times, though, is citing the fact that there's essentially one player in the banking committee who is holding back the bill from going to the floor, and that player is actually a Democratic senator, which is Jack Reed. And Jack Reed's main concern is about the certain provision that is making it more difficult for banks to shut down bank accounts of players known to be engaging in activities that are not within strict conformance to the federal laws. Now, his concern is that this will apply not only to cannabis businesses, but to other businesses that banks may have a reasonable suspicion about, and that it would hold them back from making measures that, in his view, are necessary. So interesting that that's a Democrat holding back the process. There's some hope that there might be a last minute amendment that could address those issues, or otherwise that he could be convinced to move forward with the bill. If it moves
Right.
out of committee, though, we're now seeing strong indications that the bill might actually be able to overcome a filibuster. I
Right.
saw one article in a large news outfit saying that possibly this bill was dead and that only Mitch McConnell could make the decision to move it forward and not Chuck Schumer. Now, on the flip side, we're seeing this news today about more Republican senators lending their backing to the bill.
Right. Right.
I think that we've got Susan Collins has added her name as a co-sponsor, and that's critical. A co-sponsor, not just a committed vote, but actually signing her name to the bill ahead of it moving to the floor. So
Right.
with her as one of 9 Republicans saying that they'll support the bill, that is sufficient to break the filibuster limit. And so
Right.
it really seems like it's all eyes on Jack Reed at this point. And this would, of course, make it much more easy for banks to both hold deposits but also engage in lending with the cannabis businesses in general, and would really help again to take practices like using back taxes as a strategy of mitigating costs and allow cannabis businesses to access conventional bank loans and even SBA loans, which would be a huge, huge relief to
Huge.
an industry that's overburdened by high interest rates. So, in the tech news around cannabis, we're seeing some increased attention on a practice that we've actually seen in places like Canada and in some limited markets in the United States for quite a while, for years now. I remember when Tilray first brought this practice in Canada as part of their GMP procedure. But more and more companies in states that have rigid microbial testing requirements for cannabis are looking at irradiation as a means of mitigating the failed test results for microbes by killing them and effectively sanitizing the cannabis without majorly impacting its quality. Now, I imagine that this is bringing up some questions for customers. Do you have any feel for the market out there about acceptance on this technology?
Well, I think the bottom line is that not only is it accepted technology, it's technology that's already ubiquitous. It's in use. There are currently 9, we call them food groups, I guess you could say, that are allowed through the FDA to be tested. These include meats and vegetables, and it's interesting. They're using a cobalt 60. They're truly irradiating this, but has a very short half-life, and it's very effective at destroying things inside the food. Whereas a lot of, if you're just using an infrared light, you're just going to get the surface. So, I mean, it's my opinion that it's already been proven to be safe. And the question is whether people are going to rationally assume that it would also be safe in cannabis. But as we know, with certain pesticides and other contaminants, sometimes cannabis is held to a different standard, isn't it?
Absolutely. And one thing that I think is critical about understanding this technology is that yes, there is sometimes the use of radioactive compounds as emitters for the radiation, but the radiation itself is very small particles with very short half-lives that are not
Right.
themselves emitters of radioactivity, right? So you have gamma ray radiation, beta ray radiation, and X-ray radiation. Each one of these in the case of gamma and X-ray radiation, there are no particles left behind at all. This is equivalent to having an X-ray in a medical setting. You don't
Right.
take the X-rays with you after you leave the medical procedure. It's just the X-rays are exposed to the material, and then that's it. So in this case, they're
Right.
using X-rays, which seem to be becoming maybe the preferred method for cannabis, and using an intense enough X-ray on the cannabis that essentially kills all microbial life and
Right.
then makes that product sanitary and safe for consumption. So
Right.
another key thing is understanding that this is killing bacteria like Aspergillus. They can have serious negative respiratory effects. So
Right.
it is trading off something that is already used in products to safely sanitize them that people are consuming every day, and it is saving them from potential health consequences of bacteria or mold. Now, one thing I also think that is interesting about the food use of this particular technology is you never hear about it. It's something that
Right.
has faded so far into the background of the supply chain that it's never present in the
Right.
minds of consumers, right? So
Yep.
the question is, will this happen in the cannabis industry as well, where for whatever reason, because it's new, it's novel, people are concerned about the safety of the product because of its novelty. Everything gets nitpicked, and any scary word that comes up in any press release suddenly triggers the consumer panic. But my theory is that over time, this will become something that cannabis companies use but don't talk about, and consumers don't ask about because it's completely gone from their minds about it even being a thing. And again,
Right.
this is effectively equivalent to passing your luggage through an X-ray machine at the TSA. They've just turned the wattage up on the X-ray emitter, and when it comes out, again, it's not radioactive. It's just been radiated, and everything is dead. It's not emitting
Right.
any further radiation. So now, one flip side about this is, I would say, processors that have been processing this material. Some processing methods in some states, I believe, have been considered approved for use in processing material that is contaminated or has failed these tests. In some states, they say no, burn it, or
Right.
find a way to sanitize it like irradiation.
Right.
But
Right.
this may make it so that some of that product, which otherwise would go to processors, will actually go to customers as flour. And
Right.
in some cases, that would be higher grade oil that would have been produced because it is smokable flour that might have been processed to something like a high grade shatter or batter. So those are things to look at as impacts of this technologies on extractors.
Particularly when you have states like Oregon that have gone to non-detect with aspergillus, it becomes we'll call it a very low bar or high bar to hit. And it's interesting, whenever you see a product on a shelf that says electronically pasteurized or cold pasteurized, it's been irradiated. This technology has been around for over 20 years. It's not new. It's not new.
And maybe
So
that's
I
it.
think,
Maybe this is a naming problem, and whoever was selling these devices to the cannabis industry to start should have just called them cold pasteurization machines and moved on. And,
yep,
and maybe
that's
that'll be
accepted.
the answer. Yeah.
That is the accepted term from the FDA. And obviously that's the reason it's being used in cannabis, is we're not applying temperature and not damaging those valuable terpenes and cannabinoids. I would agree. Yep, I would agree. But you mentioned an important point, which is the ability to synthesize or isomerize CBD into other useful cannabinoids and test them, make them safe, and sell them in legal markets. Now, we had an experience last week. We were doing some formulations for a client, and we experimented with vape carts with an isomer called THC-P. Do we want to get into talking a little bit about minor cannabinoids and that industry right now?
Well, we can certainly talk a bit about it. I know stay posted, everyone, for dedicated video on this subject, but it is very much on trend in the industry to try and anticipate, what is the next big cannabinoid to hit the scene. We've seen,
Right.
various high potency cannabinoids coming in. THCV has seen some traction. Of course, Delta 8 had its time. HHC, or the hydrogenated cannabinoids, had
CBN.
some moments. But this THCP is something new and something very potent. Uh,
Right.
I I am interested to see how it rolls out. There are, of course, safety considerations here that the risk for accidental overconsumption on something so potent, we're talking tens of times as strong as Delta 9 THC. It's something that has to be handled with care. At the same time, I do wonder for medical consumption whether this might be a really great option for those that need stronger medicinal doses to handle some things like pain control in conjunction with certain treatments like cancer. Of course, right now, because it's a big unknown, I don't think medical professionals are advising it to be used for that. But it certainly seems like it has great potential for both positive use and accidental overuse. Does that ring true to you, Steve?
It sounds like we should do a dedicated session on minors, because the bottom line is this. We all know what happened to the hemp market. We went from $6,000 a kilo of CBD isolate to $250 in a very short period of time. And it's interesting, you look at the hemp bill, and not but a few days after the hemp bill was signed, the DEA came in and said, CBD is a Schedule 5 substance. They've since reversed themselves on that position, but it's still in this gray area. But the point is that hemp operators and the CBD industry have really survived by making these isomerizations, these new chemicals out of CBD. And it's not unusual in the pharmaceutical industry to make these reactions. And as you know, Emmett, it's not just the isomer itself, like THC-P, that might be dangerous. There are these unknown reactants that we find. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what we've been working with those reactions and cleaning them up.
Absolutely. Yeah. So to reflect back what you just said, the DEA did try and regulate some of these isomers, or generally all of these isomers that are being produced semi-synthetically using catalysts or other sort of reactive chemistry from a cannabinoid base, saying that they were scheduled substances. Subsequently, there's been effectively little to no enforcement action on that basis. So right now, we're still seeing all of these cannabinoids being produced mainly from a CBD feedstock, some of them from CBG feedstock or other cannabinoids as the starting material, then going through some sort of reaction to convert them into another cannabinoid, either adding a functional group, changing its position, or otherwise modifying the compound. So it still has the same sort of general structure template of a cannabinoid, but it has a different activity than the pure Delta 9 or acid form THC or CBD for that matter.
Right.
These cannabinoids have long been suspected as being candidates for, initially pharmaceutical applications, where when you saw Raphael Mechoulam and other Israeli scientists, even as early as the 70s, characterizing these compounds and attempting to find ways to apply them in a medical setting. But now more and more innovation has been applied to producing these inexpensively. And as you said, when you produce these from a reaction, oftentimes there is a secondary byproduct, some compounds that are not what you're looking for that are produced as a part of that reaction. And so producing a pure stream of these cannabinoids requires cleanup of the
Right.
total mixture that you produce. We do have products like Zyput separators that are very useful at doing these fine separations, at cleaning up these reactions using liquid-liquid extraction. So we are really eager to start working with companies that are interested in producing these compounds because they have very interesting effects. However, they want to be responsible producers of pure, clean compounds that can be reliably used by formulators. So big demand, lots of interest, but it takes the right tools for the job to produce something that you can feel confident is safe.
Right. And it kind of brings us back to our original conversation, which is this is the kind of research, development, and science that's sorely needed in this industry.
Absolutely. What we'd love to see is more, practical clinical studies on the safety and efficacy of these compounds for consumers. And in the meantime, also observational studies gathering data from consumers in the field that are consuming these compounds to get general health and safety reporting on the board here.
Right.
Unfortunately, both of those right now are really lacking, especially when it comes to these semi-synthesized cannabinoids.
Right. And I know this is another session to say this, but there's a lot of valuable intellectual property rights around these miners, their formulations, the processes of extracting them or purifying them. There's a lot of IP to be had, valuable IP.
Absolutely. You know, as we know, none of these chemical conversions, none of the processes around their cleanup, even potentially in formulation and form factor, none of this is obvious. This is all first of kind applications. Yep. We are seeing some publishing of information about how these things are handled by good Samaritans looking to make sure people are producing things cleanly and effectively. Right. But this is really a ripe field for patent protections, trade secrets protections, and moving forward, I expect to see a lot of that in the coming years. Thank you for joining us on Extractor News for the month of July. We look forward to seeing you next month. Once again, I'm Emmett McGregor, CEO of Sci-Fi Systems. You can find us at sci-fi-systems.com and at Sci-Fi Systems on all social media platforms. We are a supplier of cannabis processing equipment from extraction through fine separations. If you have a challenge in the cannabis industry or you're looking to get into cannabis processing, we can be a source of solutions for you to make and maintain a lean and efficient cannabis extraction processing line. So thank you very much for joining us. Steve, any last words?
I'm struggling to say that I hope in the next 3 months we start to get clarity on rescheduling. That's all I can say. I feel strongly about that. I think it's going to happen this year. That's my last word.
All
if
right.
you pray for it. If you wish for it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. This has been Extraction News for the month of July. You can find us on YouTube, Sci-Fi Systems. Thank you very much.